Hello and welcome to another Lumberyard tutorial. My name is Derek Anderson. This tutorial brought to you by Super Effective Studio, logo and website pending. So today we're going to continue with our tutorial from the terrain sculpt and go into terrain painting. How do we paint terrain in Lumberyard? How do we get it to look all oh so pretty? So here you can see I have our sculpt from the previous tutorial, and you should have yours open in front of you in whatever iteration it exists. And let's go ahead and get started. So how do we paint terrain? We've got this nice sculpt that has very little detail in terms of color information, normal maps, all of that, specularity, all that good stuff. How do we start getting that in? There are a couple of different ways we can go about this. Like any game engine, there are several ways to get done what you want to get done. One of the most direct is using the layer painter here and actually painting directly onto the terrain. In order to do that, there are some things that we have to have set up in advance. Most important of that is, of course, your material. So if we hit the M button, that will open up our material editor. And here we can define our new materials based on what we want to put onto our terrain. You can see here I already have a number of materials set up for the purposes of this tutorial. I have 2 different types of dirt, 2 different types of snow, 2 different types of mountain rock that work well together. The reasons for this will become apparent as we continue on. I do recommend for learning this process, you don't have to have multiple materials. Ultimately, though, the more materials you have, the more realistic your environment will look. But you have to balance that versus material callouts for the engine in order to increase engine performance. So let's go ahead and get started. I have all of my materials are here. As you can see, I have diffuse, normal, and specularity maps for all of those. So having those is highly recommended. You can go in with just your diffuse, but it will not look right. Getting your diffuse, normal, and specular is, even for mockouts, is, to my mind, a necessity. So let's go ahead and get started. We have all of our materials made. It is vitally important that we set them to terrain layer under shader type. You'll also see that here there is a surface type that will let you define what type of surface your material is. That will affect things like albedo, specularity, your gloss maps, things like that. So these are things that you can play with in order to get things to look exactly how you would like them to look. So once you have all of your materials defined, and you know where they live within the Lumberyard folder structure, and you're happy with that, go ahead and open up your terrain texture layers. This is where the real magic happens. And we have a whole bunch of layers. Now, the way that this works is kind of similar to Photoshop, in that your lowest layers of terrain texture will be overwritten by the layers above it. So we have this default here. Oh, whoops, I need my material editor. Let's go ahead and pick our soil here. That'll work. So one of the first things I like to do is come in here and name my layer by whatever it is going to be. This will be soil underscore low or fill, something like that. Tells you what type of material it is and what it's being used for. With your material selected in your material editor, select your layer and then click Assign Material. Boom! You'll notice it will fill everything in here. Everything is now filled with this material. And if you find that your tiling is off, it's not tiling correctly, if you come back into your material editor, come down here under your diffuse map, scroll down, you have tiling, rotator, and oscillator. Open up your tiling and set your U and V tiling until it is something that you like. Lower seems to be a better, the higher the number, the higher the tiling, lower the number, the lower the tiling. Mine is set at 0.2. And when you set your U and V tile, it will automatically update for that material for your normal map and specular map. So you don't need to go back in and do the same thing for your diffuse. So you got that tile, and you've got it looking how you like. So there we go, base layer all the way down here. Quick little trick: if you're finding that once you start loading in your textures that your draw distance is not far enough, like you're only seeing to, let's say, right there in terms of texture. In order to fix that, go to your Terrain tab under Environment, and then here under, is that Detail? Yeah. Detail Layer View Distance, so you see how it just sort of cuts off right there. Under Detail Layer View Distance, let's just go ahead and make that 5. Boom! Now I can see my entire level textured. Oh, so pretty. Not really, but we'll get there. So, here we go, Layer Painter. Go ahead and select your Layer Painter in your Terrain tab. You will notice that our first layer that we made here, this soil fill, it has the matching name here in the Layer Painter. That's going to be very important later. And there we go, we have our first fill. Let's go ahead and make a new texture that is going to overlay onto this. So we create a new layer, it creates a new layer underneath. We can move that layer up or move the top layer down, either one works. Let's go ahead and come in here and find one of my mountain rock textures. There we go, assign that. And here's where the really interesting stuff begins. If you have sculpted in, I'm going to rename this real quick. If you have sculpted in any kind of a game engine before, then you're familiar with terrain painting and how that whole process generally works. You should also be familiar with Splat Maps. Yes, splat as in the gooey, disgusting sound. If you don't know what Splat Maps are, there are plenty of other resources out there to teach you what Splat Maps are and how to generate them. I'm not going to be covering that here. I'm going to be covering their usage in engine and talking about how Lumberyard handles Splat Maps. But there are other resources out there for you to find out what a splat map is, how it is used in terrain painting, and how it will best serve your project. One interesting thing for all of those out there watching this who do know what splat maps are, one very, very interesting thing that Lumberyard can do is that its acceptance of splat maps is based completely upon height information, not the RGB alpha information or the RGB channel information from previous engines like Unreal 3. What this allows us to do is create any number of splat maps that we need, defined by the height of the terrain, and then we can use those essentially as alpha masks within the engine to define only in these height areas will this type of texture appear. Only within an overlapping but slightly different, larger, sharper, smoother mask can we overlay this texture on top. So they're not really splat maps. They're splat masks. They let us define areas in which we want to paint our terrain, which is unassailably cool, in my opinion. That opens up the options so huge. So just to give you an illustration of what I'm talking about there, I'm going to go ahead and pull in my Photoshop. These are just some of the splat maps that I have generated for this level, just to define my textures. I mean, there's just a couple. Some of them were generated in Photoshop. Some of them were generated through World Machine using the height map output and the height picker nodes within World Machine to define which altitudes are defined by the height map, and therefore to act as masks within Lumberyard. So, getting back to it, here we have our soil and our mountain. In order to assign a splat map to your terrain, click Assign Splat Map. Find where you have hidden your maps. I did that pretty fast. And let's go ahead and pick one of our mountain splat maps. Here you can see I have 6 of them. That's twice as many as you would be able to do in Unreal Development Kit, Unreal 3. And it's so cool. I love it. So let's go ahead and pick this one. Why? Because I want to. Now you notice nothing's changed. Well, that's because we haven't told it to change anything yet. The first thing that you should do when pulling in your splat masks is to go ahead and set each of your materials up, assign your splat map to that material, and then import your splat map here. You can assign as many as you want, but the importing, this last step here, it's best to do for, I have found that it is best to do once you have all splat maps assigned to all of your materials rather than doing them one by one, because it can cause some jankiness. Every time that you bring in a new material and assign a new splat map, it essentially resets your textures on your entire paint. So it makes more sense to get all of your materials and your texture layers set up with their splat maps before you import your splat maps and begin painting. Let me give you a for instance. So let's just go ahead and import what we have here, and then we can come over here to the mountaintop here, and let's go ahead and click flood. Oh crap, it didn't work. Import. Looks like you're done there. Son of a... Sign 8-bit bump map. Oh yeah, all of your splat maps have to be in 8-bit format. Son of a, why isn't it working? Let me do something real quick, otherwise this entire tutorial is completely banjaxed. And what do we have here? Let's mountain 2, assign material, assign splat map. Aha, there we go. There is some jankiness. I have that. Okay. Now that we have multiple layers and multiple splat maps in here, we can start seeing what we have, I believe. Let's go ahead and flood that. And mountaintop, flood, no. It is still doing what I told it not to do. Alright, well, I'm not exactly sure why that's not working this time. But that is exactly how I did it before. And it worked out great before. Okay, I'm not exactly sure why that's not working out the way that it did in my final piece that I will use to illustrate, but it didn't work out this time. Lord knows why. So we have our splat masks in, and what we should be able to do is click on our layer, click flood, and then it will flood our mask area, our splat mask area, with that texture. In this case, it's just flooding everything with it. I'm not exactly sure why. I will have to dig deeper into that. But that is one way that we can control how our textures are applied. Another way we can control how our textures are applied to our terrain is using these values here in these, like, I don't know why they did these pastel, very light tones here with, you know, a 20% gray text. It's incredibly hard to read, very, very annoying. If anybody from Lumberyard is watching this, oh, please change that. And soon. Another thing that we can do here inside of our terrain texture layers is set our min height and max height for any given piece of terrain. So let's say, for instance, we have this mountain layers terrain. I'm going to go ahead and set a minimum height of 110, that's meters within the engine, and 250 as a maximum height of meters within the engine. And then just for the heck of it, I'm going to go ahead and hit flood. Now you can see that this has given us a solid line of where it is using that mask, or where it is filling in that terrain. So we've set this to, you know, only appear at a certain height, and just using the flood button, we've quickly textured all of that. But, you know, it doesn't look right. And you can play with these settings here until you get something that you like. Yeah, that's another thing to keep in mind, is it can be very finicky in terms of where, when, how much. I see. So it is filling in there. This is where I wish the masks were working. If the masks were working properly while doing this tutorial, we would have that sharp line right down here. And doing this with each of our another thing we can do is set our minimum and maximum angle for any given flood. So let's go ahead and set this minimum angle. Why don't we go ahead and set that to 15 degrees and maximum angle of 80. This is not going to look right, but we're going to do it anyway. And here you can see we are starting to get some breakup in our texture fill. Like, it's not filling in on just the flat areas. Let me go ahead and make that an even more dramatic, just for the sake of illustration. There we go. Now you see we're starting to get this breakup of where the textures are being applied. You know, we have it completely off of our ground now, and it is starting to apply this mountainy rock texture to the angles here. So it's starting to look at just a few clicks of a button, more like what we want. We're starting to get closer and closer. And so by coming in here and playing with your min height, max height, your min angle, and max angle, we can get a heck of a lot more control over where we are putting our textures just with a few clicks. Combined with the splat masks, this really lets us define areas of the terrain very, very quickly. Now, I use this process on another level of mine. I'm going to go ahead and load that up so you can see sort of what that's supposed to look like. We wait for Lumberyard to think. Here we go. So here we have this terrain, and I have done, just what I showed you. I have all of my terrain layers. They all have, some of them have splat maps attached to them. Some of them don't. And using the min-max values here, I have gone through and sort of defined those variables and used the fill to quickly texture my environment. Now, this is not by any means the the final iteration. All of this, will, of course, you'll have to go through and touch these up, coming through with your brush and blending together. There are various ways to go about doing that. That I am still exploring options on those, and I will release those in another tutorial. But really quick, that's how you can quickly texture your scene and get multiple materials made and textured and put into your environment so you can start conceptualizing very, very quickly and start getting your feels on in your game engine. So that's pretty much what I have done. That's a process that I have been using and exploring. It seems to work fairly well. There are still some kinks I need to work out, and as I start getting deeper into how this will work, I will release another tutorial. But for now, that's where we're at. Please comment below, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.